I'm Nathan Rutherford, and welcome to Myth Madness. The last few episodes touched on the adventure for the Golden Fleece in some way or another. This quest was a very special event in Greek mythology. It is an example of a time when multiple heroes from different parts of Greece all came together to get a certain job done. There are a couple other examples of other events like this in Greek myth. The Trojan War, when many heroes from many different Greek kingdoms assembled together to go fight the Trojans, is the best example. But there are other heroes joining heroes events, and one fantastic example happens shortly after the Argonauts' voyage for the Golden Fleece. It also features many of the same heroes. This adventure took place in a part of Greece that the pod has not spent a lot of time in so far, a kingdom called Calydon. The two heroes who are at the center of this story are the fierce huntress Atalanta and the formidable warrior Meleager. The city-state kingdom of Calydon was nestled in the mountains of Aetolia, a region of western Greece. It was relatively close to the Oracle of Delphi. The king of Calydon was Oeneus, a name which means wine man. He got the name because he was a disciple of the god Dionysus. As I've mentioned before, the god Dionysus once traveled the world. When he returned to Greece, he found the people there less than friendly. The people viewed him not as a god, but as a strange foreigner who was corrupting the younger generations and especially women. Problems ensued, especially for Thebes, as I went over in the Dionysus and Cadmus episodes. But unlike a lot of Greek kings, Oeneus welcomed the god to Calydon. In fact, he was so friendly, according to the Roman poet Hyginus, that the king let Dionysus sleep with his wife Althea. Dionysus was very impressed with the Calydonian hospitality, and this restored Dionysus's faith in the Greeks as a people. As a reward, the god taught Oeneus winemaking. He was the very first person Dionysus taught this to. Hence, King Oeneus, King Wine Man. Oeneus was blessed by the gods in other ways too. In the normal, usual way, he had plenty of children. Some of them, both sons and daughters, appear in several different myths. One important one was Deianira. In some versions, Deianira's real father was Dionysus, since Althea became pregnant after he paid Calydon a visit. Deianira was a tomboy, able to drive a chariot, and even joined her male family members in battles. Deianira eventually ended up marrying Heracles after he won a wrestling contest with a river spirit. Eventually, she sadly caused the great hero's death. Another child was Tydeus. Oeneus either had him with his second wife, or, disturbingly, his own daughter Gorgy. That version is recorded by Apollodorus, who says Zeus made Oeneus lust after his own daughter. No word on why Zeus thought this was necessary. Tydeus himself turned out to be a troubled youth. He killed a family member, sometimes an uncle, sometimes multiple cousins, and was exiled for the murder. He became a fairly psychotic mercenary, even by Greek hero standards. We'll see him again in later episodes. Oeneus' most famous son, and likely his favorite, was Meleager, who was also one of the famous Argonauts. He was, in fact, supposed to be the strongest Argonaut, second only to the mighty Heracles. In some versions, like with his sister Deianira, Meleager's true father is a god. In Meleager's case, the immortal parent is not Dionysus, but is instead the war god Ares. When I said Oeneus was blessed by the gods, I originally meant he just had a big family. Turns out, though, some of the gods took a very active role in giving him that big family. In some versions, his wife even gave birth to another son whose father was Poseidon. For those counting, that brings the grand total up to 3 immortals, and makes Althea one of the more prolific lovers of gods. When Meleager was born, the Moirae, the fate goddesses, appeared to declare the new baby's destiny. They pointed to the fireplace and declared Meleager would only live until a particular log already in the family hearth was burnt down by flame. Not a particularly good fortune for Meleager. The flames already licked across the log. The baby should have shortly died. But fortunately for him, his mother heard the Moirai's prophecy. She rushed to the fireplace and pulled out the log, patting the flames away. Then, without anyone knowing, Althea went and found a secluded spot in the palace garden and buried the log. I'll point out that Althea's quick actions twisted the Moirai's prophecy. Instead of simply being a comment on infant mortality, it was now a way for Meleager to achieve immortality. If the log remained hidden and never burned to ash, Meleager would not die. With all the attention Oeneus's family was getting from immortal gods and goddesses, you might think the king of Calydon would be especially careful about honoring all of the immortals. Unfortunately, he was careless. This story goes all the way back to the 8th century BC, and is covered in Homer's Iliad and several later sources, such as Diodorus, Apollodorus, and others. One year, at harvest time, Oeneus made sacrifices of the finest fruits first picked from his orchards. All of the gods received their fair share, except for Artemis, either because Oeneus forgot or left her out on purpose. Regardless of the reason, the goddess was extremely offended. Oeneus would pay. Artemis sent a boar, a fierce wild boar with shining teeth and gleaming tusks, to ravage Calydon. It decimated Oeneus's prized orchards, ripping up trees, stamping on flowers, and pulling up the roots of his carefully planted lines of fruit trees. The land was made unsowable. Whole herds and people were killed by the boar. To save the kingdom, Oeneus tasked his now adult son Meleager with ridding the countryside of the Calydonian Boar. To do so, the young man put out a call to all the skilled hunters from all across Greece to assemble at Oeneus's palace. Many answered the summons. Many of these were former Argonauts like Meleager. There's Castor and Polydeuces, the famous sons of Zeus and hero twins from Sparta. There's Idas and Lynceus, 2 more twins, this time the sons of the king of Messene. 2 more Argonaut brothers, Peleus and Telamon, as well as Peleus's father-in-law, Eurytion, also came. Jason, the original leader of the Argonauts, supposedly came too, as well as some others like Admetus and Ancaeus, the Argonaut who only wore a bear skin and carried a great big axe. Essentially, this hunt is a good enough excuse for all the heroes to assemble together again, to get the band back together, to camp out with their friends in the woods. But besides former Argonauts, some other heroes joined too. Iphicles, the brother of Heracles, Theseus from Athens, Pirithous from Larissa, Amphiaraus of Thebes, Laertes from Ithaca. To add to that, Meleager's various uncles, called the sons of Thestius, also joined. Like with the list of Argonauts, the list of hunters changes slightly across the 4 sources for this myth. There is a core group of hunters which include the ones I've listed here, but there are also a handful of others who are only mentioned in 1 or 2 sources. What's happening here is likely the same as what happened with all the different lists of Argonauts. Storytellers sometimes added to the list on their own, probably adding heroes who were linked to the communities they passed through. But finally, there was one more hero who answered Meleager's call. This was Atalanta, a young woman and a fierce hunter. We have actually met Atalanta already. In part 1 of my retelling of the hero Jason's myths, I provided a list of a number of different heroes who came from across Greece to join Jason on his quest for the Golden Fleece. Atalanta was one of those heroes. She arrived in Iolcos and asked Jason if she could be an Argonaut, presenting him with a fine spear. In Apollonius's Argonautica, which is the main source for that story that survives and served the basis of my retelling, Jason said no. He told her she could not join, not because he doubted her skill, but because having a woman on board the ship, and only one woman at that, would cause arguments and fights to break out between the other men. A disappointing turn of events. However, that is Apollonius's version. In another, recorded by Diodorus, Atalanta does join the Golden Fleece adventure, and fights with the other Greek heroes in a battle when they get to their destination. But whether she joined the Argonauts or not, by the time of the hunt for the Calydonian Boar, Atalanta had gained her own very impressive reputation. So let's back up a moment. Atalanta was the daughter of a man named Iasus. Her father wanted sons and was disappointed by the birth of a girl. So disappointed, in fact, he decided he wanted nothing to do with her. Iasus left the baby girl exposed on an Arcadian mountainside, leaving her to the wind and the rain and the wild animals. The baby was found by a female bear. Instead of eating the baby, the bear nursed her like one of its own cubs. Eventually, some hunters found the bear in the woods and saw that a small toddler followed it. The hunters chased the bear away, separating the girl from its surrogate bear mother. The men chose to adopt the feral child themselves and named the girl Atalanta. After growing up, Atalanta was devoted to the goddess Artemis. Like the goddess, she stayed away from men, remained a virgin, and spent her time living and hunting in the wilderness. In her cave high up in the mountains, the skins of beasts were Atalanta's bed, their flesh her food, and water her only drink. She became a quick runner and an even better hunter. This simple, active lifestyle made Atalanta bigger than any full-grown woman, and more beautiful than any young woman. She had a fiery gaze, rosy cheeks, and there was nothing delicate about her. Even though Atalanta stayed away from other people, while hunting she sometimes encountered them anyway. In one instance, the centaurs, Roikos and Hylaeus, burst in on her at night. But Atalanta was no fool, and realized they had come to rape her. Unflinchingly, she shot them dead with arrows. Later, after Jason completed his quest for the Golden Fleece, the Argonauts returned to Iolcos. Jason's uncle Pelias, who had sent him on the quest in the first place, died. In the Medea episode, I talked about how Jason and Medea were to blame for Pelias's death, but that isn't important for this episode right now. What is important is that after Pelias died, the people of Iolcos threw an athletic tournament. This tournament aligned with Pelias's funeral, and was intended to honor the recently deceased king. Heroes and athletes from far and wide came to take part in the competitions. Some of these people were former Argonauts, and Atalanta also went to take part. At the funeral games, Atalanta came face to face with the hero Peleus in a wrestling competition. She won. So, with this reputation, skilled archer and hunter, centaur slayer, wrestling champion, Atalanta made her way to Calydon to join the hunt for the Calydonian Boar. All the heroic hunters were now gathered in Calydon, and King Oeneus feasted them for a full 9 days. On the 10th day, trouble arose. 2 of the hunters, Ancaeus, the former Argonaut, and another man named Cepheus, and some of the others, objected to Atalanta joining the hunt, because she was a woman. For Atalanta, this probably seemed like a frustrating case of déjà vu, but unlike with Apollonius's Jason, this time, Meleager, the host of the hunt, convinced the men to let her join. However, Meleager didn't do this only for the reason of fairness. The young man had a secondary ulterior motive. He was married to a woman named Cleopatra, the daughter of fellow hunter and Argonaut Idas. But Meleager was attracted to the tall, wild beauty of Atalanta and hoped to sleep with her. To Meleager, letting her join the hunt would keep her around and make them closer, something that would certainly not happen if he sent her away. With Atalanta joining them, the assembled hunters finally set out from Aeneas's palace and headed to the dense woodland nearby. Reaching it, the heroes found the footprints of a huge boar. They spread their nets between the trees, let their hounds off their leashes, and followed the trail into the dark and wild forest. All of them dreamed of finding glory in the forest, but not all of them were going to come back out alive. Hours passed, and in a marshy part of the forest, they found their prey. Or maybe it found them. Out of the bushes, the boar charged straight at the heroes. Its eyes were ablaze, its neck solid, its bristles long and sharp. The boar smelled their blood. It hissed and snorted hot foam from its mouth. The sound echoed through the wood. The boar scattered the hounds out of its way. The hunters shouted and held their spears outwards. Ancaeus raised his double-headed axe and stood to face the incoming charge. But the boar was too quick. It plunged its tusks into him. He fell, and his guts gushed out and soaked the ground. The Argonaut Ancaeus was dead. Another hero, Peleus, threw his javelin at the boar, but missed. The javelin flew through the air, and instead of meeting boar flesh, it flew into the chest of Peleus's father-in-law, Eurydion. As the boar charged on and the hunt continued, Peleus held Eurydion as he died in his arms. The others followed the boar deeper into the forest. Atalanta was the first to strike the boar with an arrow, hitting it in the back. The Theban hunter, Amphiaraus, was second, shooting the boar in the eye. The animal screeched in pain, and finally Meleager delivered the killing blow. The Calydonian Boar, the scourge of an angry Artemis, fell dead. The hunt was over. Like with most hunts, the heroes gathered around the corpse of the boar. Together they cleaned the body and skinned its hide. Since he was the one who killed it, the hunters awarded the boar skin to Meleager. The hero took it from them, and then turned around and presented it to Atalanta, saying she was the first to strike the beast and made the kill possible. This gesture, though Atalanta certainly appreciated it, did not go over well with the other hunters, especially Meleager's uncles, the sons of his maternal grandfather, Thestius. They objected to a woman taking the skin. At least, that was their real reason. The reason they gave was that if Meleager declined the skin, then it should belong to Meleager's kinsmen in the hunting party. In other words, they claimed it belonged to them. They snatched the skin from Atalanta. Meleager urged them to return the skin to Atalanta, but they ignored him. The argument turned into a fight. Infuriated, Meleager killed his uncles. He then, once again, presented the boar skin to Atalanta. In doing so, he chose his desire for Atalanta over his family, and committed the great crime of killing his relatives. Atalanta may have appreciated his attempts to include her in the hunt, and standing up for her to his uncles. One source, Hyginus's Fabulae, actually says that Meleager and Atalanta had a child together, implying Meleager's attempts to sleep with Atalanta paid off after all. But, after the hunt, when Meleager's mother Althea found out her brothers were dead and her son was to blame, she was traumatized. In her grief, she wandered through the palace over to her secret spot and dug up Meleager's log. Angry, grief-stricken, and feeling dishonored, Althea threw the log into a roaring fire. When it turned to ash, the Moire's prophecy was complete, and Meleager fell dead. All of this was ultimately caused by the goddess Artemis, and intended as a punishment for Oeneus not honoring her properly. While the most detailed sources for this story are from the later centuries of Greek history, the roots of the story go all the way back to the archaic days of Homer and Hesiod. Both Homer and Hesiod say Meleager killed the fierce wild boar with the gleaming tusks. But with the death of the Calydonian Boar, Artemis, the Lady of Arrows, was not done. As described by Homer, she caused a great clamoring and shouting between the Calydonians and another tribe, the Curetes, over the head and shaggy hide of the dead boar. So what we have here is a hint about the later fight between Meleager and his uncles, although here it's described more as a big battle. In Homer's same description, at least one of Meleager's uncles is one of these enemy combatants, and is killed by the hero. And similar to the later version, his mother Althea is so upset she called on Hades and Persephone to kill her son, and he died because of this curse. The two traditions align quite closely, and it's possible they would align more if you assume Homer just purposely left some things out because he didn't think they were relevant to his epic poem. And in fact, that may have been the case. Homer leaves out the rather wacky part about the log, but we know that part of the myth goes back to at least the beginning of the 5th century BC. The story is told in one of the odes by the poet Bacchylides. In it, chaos ensues after the killing of the boar, and Meleager kills some of his relatives. While he fights another battle somewhere else, again hinting at a larger civil war over the boar skin, his mother burns his log, and he falls to death on the battlefield at the moment of another victory. In some versions, Althea kills herself shortly afterwards. When their brother died, Meleager's sisters were so upset, the gods turned them into birds. So, what happened to Atalanta after the hunt was over? Remember the version that had Atalanta get pregnant with Meleager's son? Well, after Meleager's death, like her father did with her, Atalanta exposed the baby on the slopes of Mount Parthenius. As you might expect, the baby boy did not die. Instead, he was found by shepherds and named Parthenopaeus. when he grew up, he's going to get into some trouble himself. Later, according to Apollodorus, Atalanta was reconciled with her biological father. Her father urged her to marry, and she said she would only marry the man who could beat her in a foot race. In fact, Atalanta forced all her suitors to race her. Since she was already known as a fast runner, she gave them a head start. Plus, while they could run disrobed for easy running, Atalanta ran with weapons. But the weapons were not to weigh her down. She ran with them, because when she caught up to the men, she cut them down and killed them. In this way, Atalanta killed many men. Hyginus adds the grisly detail that afterwards she would take their heads and line them up on a wall with the others, probably as a warning to other potential suitors to not waste her time. However, men with little common sense still turned up. Eventually, along came another hero who wanted to race. He is usually called Hippomenes, but sometimes his name is Meleager. The stories go much the same way either way. This is the main myth for Hippomenes, but he may have had other stories about him that did not survive to us today. He was a grandson of the god Poseidon. Under his other name, Meleager, there is a reference to him being a student of the centaur sage Chiron, and he may have already met Atalanta, because there are some mentions of him as a hunter for the Calydonian Boar. This man, Hippomenes, gained the favor of the goddess Aphrodite. The goddess decided to help him in his race with Atalanta. Aphrodite gave him 3 apples of exceptional beauty. In the oldest yet fragmentary existing source for this story, the poet Hesiod just refers to apples. In other later works, they are typically described as golden apples. Apples like this pop up in a few places in Greek mythology. Probably one of the best other examples are the golden apples of the Hesperides. These were the golden apples that Heracles was sent to collect. It seems some of the ancient Greeks and Romans tried to make sense of these different apples. One man, Servius, said the golden apples given to Hippomenes were actually from the garden of the Hesperides, but the poet Ovid says they belonged to Aphrodite and were from her own garden. But no matter how Aphrodite got them, she gave some apples to Hippomenes and told him how to use them to his advantage. How the foot race unfolds is fairly consistent in the versions recorded by Hesiod in the Archaic period and Hyginus, Ovid, and Apollodorus almost 1,000 years later. But Ovid, in typical Ovid fashion, is the longest and frankly the most fun description. First, Hippomenes watched Atalanta race some other young man. He watched her run by, while her hair was tossed back over her shoulders and a pink flush crept over her white body. In this version, she also runs naked. Hippomenes fell in love, and now knew why so many young men had risked their lives to race her. After Atalanta won once again, Hippomenes stood up and boldly said that she should race him next. While Hippomenes was in love and desired her, Atalanta, for her part, was struck by the man's youth. She thought to herself that he was more beautiful than her, and thought she could come to desire him, but also thought he was still just a boy. When the race began, Atalanta quickly caught up to Hippomenes. When she could pass him, she delayed her speed, but after gazing on his face, reluctantly moved to pass him anyway. At that point, Hippomenes made use of Aphrodite's apples. I guess he was running with them, because he threw one up ahead of Atalanta. Atalanta stopped to pick it up, and Hippomenes was free to run on past her. She caught up to him again, and Hippomenes threw the second apple to pass her once more. The race was still not finished, and Atalanta caught up again. Hippomenes threw the final golden apple. This time, Ovid says, Atalanta hesitated. But fortunately for Hippomenes, Aphrodite intervened. The goddess compelled Atalanta to turn for the apple and pick it up. Aphrodite also made the fruit a little bit heavier, slowing Atalanta down with weight and loss of time. Hippomenes ran ahead to victory, and Atalanta had finally found her husband. But Hippomenes, now with his new wife, forgot to make a sacrifice to thank Aphrodite. The goddess was deeply offended. If it weren't for her, Atalanta would be racing someone else, and Hippomenes' severed head would be decorating a wall. The goddess decided to make the humans pay. Hippomenes took Atalanta back to his home. On the way, after a weary day of traveling, they stopped for rest. the newlyweds found refuge in an old temple. As they rested inside, they were consumed with an intense passion for each other that they could not control. They slept together, desecrating the sacred place. In response to this outrage, Zeus turned both of the lovers into lions or leopards. Ovid and Hyginus both have Atalanta and Hippomenes victims of a lust inflicted on them by a vengeful Aphrodite. But in other versions, they have more free will. In those versions, what this is a representation of Atalanta's fatal flaw, her lack of moderation. In terms of her sexuality, she either shows complete abstinence or impulsive gratification. In the first half of this episode, I told the story of Meleager's hunt for the Calydonian Boar and the role Atalanta played in it. The roots of the boar hunt go all the way back to at least the 8th century BC, with references in Homer's Iliad and Hesiod's Catalogue of Women. In those surviving snippets, Meleager is front and center, with Atalanta left out. But that does not necessarily mean Atalanta was missing from the tradition referenced by those sources. The Iliad reference focuses on the wrath of Artemis, and the one in the Catalogue of Women focuses on the relationship between Meleager and his mother, so it makes sense that Atalanta is maybe not mentioned in either one. A few centuries later, Euripides wrote a play called Meleager in the 5th century BC. The play is lost, but was likely a tragedy and told the story of Meleager's death. It may have involved his mother burning the log and possibly also the gift of the boar skin to Atalanta. We know both of these elements absolutely existed by that time. The log part is in a poem by Bacchylides, and Atalanta fights the boar in art from the same period. Euripides likely used these events in his play, but probably also provided his own twists, as he often did in his other plays. The earliest specific literary reference to Atalanta's participation in the hunt in the 3rd century BC. Later, we get the excellently detailed versions recorded by Hyginus, Ovid, and Apollodorus I used for my retellings in this episode. Like with the boar hunt, the myth about Atalanta's foot race also goes back a fair ways to at least the 7th century BC. But interestingly, in the early sources, her father's name is different. Instead of being the exposed daughter of Iasus, she is the daughter of a man named Scoinius. What's more is different locations are given for the setting in the different versions of this story. In the boar hunt, Atalanta is said to be from Arcadia in southern Greece, but in some of the foot race stories, she lives near Thebes, in the Boeotia region of central Greece. Taken together, this has made some scholars conclude that there were originally 2 different Atalantas in Greek mythology. One of these Atalantas lived in Arcadia and attended the hunt for the Calydonian Boar and maybe had a son with Meleager, and a second, more maidenly Atalanta lived near Thebes and who ran in the foot race with Hippomenes. However, while they may have originally been separate people, that was not the case later on. Later sources treat these mythic events as happening to the same huntress hero. By the time of Ovid and Apollodorus, there are no hints they were separate women. Instead, their stories are presented as one complete narrative. Same Atalanta or different Atalanta, it just goes to show how either the tradition shifted over time, either with Atalanta being co-opted by another region and assigned a new father and birthplace, or how 2 Atalantas were merged over time. It's all par for the course in the ever-evolving and vibrant oral tradition that was ancient Greek mythology. And that's all for today. If you're enjoying the podcast, kindly leave a review on your podcast streamer of choice. It really helps with building awareness for the pod. As always, thank you for listening.